In the frost-bitten winter of 1868, two broken souls collided in the blood-stained snow of the Wyoming Territory. One, a Cheyenne mother clutching her silent child, her entire world reduced to this single, precious life. The other, an army surgeon, haunted by the ghosts of those he couldn't save. Neither spoke the other's language, neither trusted the other's world. Yet in the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier, they would discover that healing comes in many forms, and family is not always bound by blood. This is the story of Sarah Blackfeather and Dr. James Holloway, and how, amid hatred and violence, they forged a connection that would change not just their lives, but the very fabric of a divided community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Wyoming Territory, December 1868. The wind carried ice and the distant sound of wolves as Dr. James Holloway rode alongside the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry. His breath formed clouds in the biting air as he pulled his military-issued coat tighter. At 42, he was too old for this mission, too broken by the war that had ended 3 years prior. Yet here he was, riding toward what the army called a hostile encampment. James knew better. 2 decades as a military surgeon had taught him that words like hostile and pacification were simply masks for uglier truths. He'd joined this patrol only because Captain Williams had insisted they needed a medical officer. Now, as the grey sky threatened snow, James wondered if he could stomach whatever lay ahead. "Almost there, Doc," Lieutenant Parker called back, his young face unmarked by the horrors James had witnessed during the Civil War. Scouts spotted smoke about 2 miles east. James nodded, saying nothing. The soldiers around him were mostly boys, none older than 25, many having joined after the war had already ended. They hadn't seen Gettysburg or Antietam. They hadn't knelt in mud and blood, trying to hold a boy's insides together while he called for his mother. But James had. "Remember," Captain Williams addressed the 30 men, "General Sheridan's orders are clear. Any Cheyenne outside the reservation boundaries are to be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly." The words turned James's stomach. 3 years after Appomattox, he'd hoped to never again be party to violence. After losing his wife Caroline to consumption and their son Thomas on a Virginia battlefield, James had volunteered for frontier duty seeking escape. Instead, he found himself riding toward another kind of war. "Captain," James finally spoke, his deep voice carrying across the cold air, "I was told this was a reconnaissance mission." Williams didn't turn. "Circumstances change, Doctor. I suggest you prepare your medical supplies." The small camp came into view as they crested a hill. 7 lodges arranged in a circle, thin spirals of cooking smoke rising into the grey sky. James could make out figures moving between the structures. Women hanging meat to dry, children carrying water, no warriors standing guard, no weapons visible. "This isn't a war party," James said, an edge to his voice. "These are families." "They're off the reservation, Doc," Lieutenant Parker replied. "Orders are orders." What happened next would haunt James for the rest of his days. Captain Williams raised his arm, and 30 men charged down the hill, rifles ready. James remained frozen atop his horse, watching as the peaceful scene erupted into chaos. Women grabbed children, elders emerged from lodges, and a handful of men stepped forward, arms raised in surrender. But the 7th Cavalry hadn't come to accept surrender. The first shots cracked through the winter air, and James finally spurred his horse forward, not toward the soldiers but around them, toward the backside of the camp. His medical bag bounced against his side as he rode, though he knew there would be little he could do. This wasn't battle, it was slaughter. Near the edge of the camp, a flash of movement caught his eye. A woman, clutching something to her chest, disappeared into a thicket of bare trees. Without thinking, James turned his horse toward her, away from the sounds of death that filled. The valley. He found her collapsed in the snow, half a mile from the camp, the small bundle in her arms, stirring slightly. She was young, perhaps 25, her black hair falling across a face contorted in pain. Blood stained the snow beneath her, flowing from a wound in her side. James dismounted, approaching slowly, hands raised to show he carried no weapon. The woman's eyes, dark with pain and fear, fixed on his uniform. She clutched the bundle, a child of perhaps 4 years, tighter and tried to crawl backward. "I'm a doctor," James said, knowing she wouldn't understand his words but hoping his tone might convey his intent. "Let me help you." The woman spat words at him in Cheyenne, her face twisted with hatred. James couldn't blame her. He knelt in the snow, slowly opening his medical bag, maintaining eye contact. He removed a bandage, pointed to her wound, then to the bandage. The child in her arms turned, revealing the face of a little girl with her mother's eyes. Unlike her mother, the child made no sound, watching James with a penetrating gaze that seemed far older than her years. The gunfire had stopped. Soon the soldiers would be looking for stragglers. James made a quick decision. He pointed to himself, the woman and the child, then to his horse. When the woman didn't respond, he mimed riding away. She glanced back toward the camp, and something in her expression told James she understood what had happened there. Still clutching her child, she gave a single, sharp nod. Getting both the wounded woman and the child onto his horse was a struggle, but James managed it, climbing up behind them. He turned the horse north, away from the camp, away from the patrol, toward a line of hills where he knew of a sheltered valley. Captain Williams would assume he'd ridden back to Fort Laramie ahead of the patrol. It wouldn't be the first time. James had avoided the aftermath of violence. The woman remained tense against him, one arm around her child, the other pressed to her bleeding side. The little girl never made a sound, not even when the horse stumbled on icy ground. James found himself wondering if she could speak at all, or if the horrors she'd witnessed had struck her mute. 2 hours later, as darkness began to fall, they reached the valley. A small trapper's cabin stood near a frozen stream, abandoned years earlier, but still offering shelter from the wind and snow that had begun to fall. James helped the woman and child inside, relieved to find the stone fireplace intact and a small stack of firewood left by some previous occupant. As flames began to catch on the dry kindling, James turned to his patient. The woman had collapsed onto the cabin's single cot, her breathing shallow. The wound in her side had soaked through her dress, and her skin had taken on the grey pallor James knew too well. "I need to look at your wound," he said, approaching slowly. The woman watched him with eyes growing glassy from blood loss. When he reached for her, she said something sharply, then pulled her child closer and whispered in her ear. The little girl turned to James and made a series of gestures with her small hands. Sign language, James realized. The Cheyenne, like many Plains tribes, used an elaborate system of hand signals to communicate across language barriers. The child was translating for her mother. James shook his head apologetically. "I don't understand," he said. The woman seemed to grasp his confusion. She spoke again to her daughter, who watched James intently before pointing to her mother's wound, then to James's medical bag. "Yes," James nodded, relief washing over him. "Yes, I can help." What followed was a delicate dance of trust and necessity. The woman allowed James to clean and bandage her wound. A rifle ball had passed through her side, miraculously missing vital organs, while her daughter sat beside her, small, solemn, her face. The child never spoke, communicating only through gestures or expressions, yet her presence served as a bridge between the wounded Cheyenne woman and the army doctor. After bandaging the wound and helping the woman swallow a small dose of laudanum for the pain, James set about making the cabin habitable. He melted snow for water, found a dusty tin of coffee in his saddlebag, and offered hardtack from his rations. The woman took only water, but allowed her daughter to eat the softened hardtack James prepared. As the fire cast flickering shadows on the cabin walls, James sat on an overturned crate, watching his unlikely companions. The woman's features had relaxed somewhat, either from the laudanum or from the realization that he didn't intend them harm. The little girl had curled against her mother's side, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but still watching James warily. "My name is James," he said, touching his chest, hoping to establish some basic communication. "James Holloway." The woman studied him for a long moment before responding. "Sarah," she said in a clear, accented voice that startled him. She touched her chest, then her daughter's head. "Hannah." James couldn't hide his surprise. "You speak English?" Sarah's expression hardened. "Some. Mission school. She didn't finish, but James understood. Before the army began forcing tribes onto reservations, before the treaties were broken, before today. "Hannah?" he asked, gesturing to the silent child. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair. "Born hearing no sounds. Speak with hands." She demonstrated by making several quick gestures that Hannah watched intently. "See everything, says nothing." James nodded, a lump forming in his throat as he thought of all the child had witnessed that day. In some ways, her silence seemed a blessing. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate even to his own ears. "For what happened, for what my people did." Sarah's dark eyes bore into his. "You did not shoot." "No, but I rode with them. I wear this uniform." James gestured to his blood-stained army coat. "I'm a part of it, whether I want to be or not." For a long moment, the cabin was silent except for the crackling of the fire and the wind whistling through small gaps in the walls. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice stronger. "Why help us?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. James looked down at his hands. The surgeon's hands that had saved countless lives and failed to save so many others, including his own son. "I've seen enough death," he said finally. I couldn't just watch it happen again." Sarah seemed to accept this answer. She whispered something to Hannah in Cheyenne, and the little girl's posture relaxed slightly. "Sleep now," James said, rising to add more wood to the fire. "You need to rest if that wound is going to heal." As Sarah's eyes drifted closed, James settled back onto his crate. He had no illusion about the complexity of their situation. A wounded Cheyenne woman and her deaf child, sheltered by an army doctor in violation of his duty. If they were discovered, he would face court-martial at best, hanging at worst. And even if they remained hidden, what then? He couldn't return. Sarah and Hannah to their people. There was no one left to return to. The reservation wasn't safe for them, not with the military's current posture toward hostiles. Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering their tracks, isolating the small cabin from the world. James watched the silent child who had finally succumbed to sleep beside her mother. Hannah's small hand remained clutched around something, a beaded amulet that must have held deep significance. Despite everything she had endured, there was a resilience in her delicate features that reminded James painfully of his son. In the shifting firelight, James made a decision that would alter the course of his life. These two strangers from a world so different from his own had been placed in his path for a reason. He had failed to protect his own family, but perhaps he could save this one. Come morning, they would head west, away from the forts and settlements, toward the mountains where he had a friend, a former army scout turned recluse who had married a Shoshone woman. It was a dangerous journey of over 100 miles through winter terrain, but it offered the only chance for Sarah and Hannah to find safety. As the night deepened, James felt something he hadn't experienced since receiving word of his son's death at Cold Harbor. Purpose. It wasn't redemption. Not exactly. No act could erase his complicity in the army's campaign against the Plains tribes. But perhaps, in helping this mother and child, he might reclaim some small piece of his humanity. The wind howled outside, but within the cabin, 3 survivors of different tragedies shared a moment of fragile peace. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but for now, they had found a temporary sanctuary in the most unlikely of circumstances. James Holloway, who had spent years running from his past, found himself facing an uncertain future with unexpected companions. And for the first time in too long, the prospect didn't fill him with dread. Dawn broke with unforgiving clarity over the isolated cabin. James woke with a start, momentarily disoriented, until the events of the previous day came rushing back. He had fallen asleep, sitting upright, his back against the rough-hewn wall, and now every muscle protested the movement. Across the small space, Sarah was awake, her dark eyes watching him steadily as she stroked her daughter's hair. Hannah still slept, her small face peaceful in a way that made James's chest ache. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "How is your wound?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Sarah shifted slightly, wincing. "It burns." James approached carefully, maintaining a respectful distance until she nodded permission for him to check the bandage. The edges of the wound looked angry and red, but there was no sign of the deadly infection he feared. "We need to clean it again," he said, "and you need to eat something." Outside, the world had transformed overnight. Nearly a foot of snow blanketed the landscape, erasing their tracks, and James hoped, making it impossible for anyone to follow them. It also meant travel would be treacherous, especially for a wounded woman and young child. James melted snow for fresh water and retrieved dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebag. As he worked, he felt Sarah's gaze following his movements. When he glanced at her, she didn't look away. "Your uniform," she said suddenly, "not like others." James looked down at his army surgeon's coat with its distinctive insignia. "I'm a doctor, not a soldier. I fix people, I don't—" He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought in front of Hannah, who had stirred and was now watching him with those solemn eyes. "You cut people," Sarah said bluntly. "Medicine man." James hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sometimes I have to cut to heal." He gestured to her bandaged side. "Like with your wound." Hannah sat up then, making a series of quick, fluid gestures to her mother. Sarah responded in kind, her hands forming shapes James couldn't begin to interpret. "She asks why you help the enemy," Sarah translated, her expression guarded. The question, so direct from one so young, caught James off guard. He considered his answer carefully, aware that his response mattered more than perhaps any diagnosis he'd ever given. "I don't see enemies when I look at you," he said simply. "I see people who need help." Sarah translated his words into signs for Hannah, whose small face remained impassive. Then the child made another gesture, touching her chest and then pointing to James with a questioning tilt of her head. "She asks your name for her," Sarah explained, "in hand talk." James realized Hannah needed a sign name for him, something easier than spelling out Dr. Holloway each time. "What should it be?" Sarah and Hannah exchanged a look. Then Hannah deliberately touched her temple with 2 fingers, then moved them in a circular motion near her chest. "She names you Thinking Heart," Sarah said, the faintest hint of amusement touching her lips. "She says you think too much but have a good heart." Something loosened in James's chest at this acceptance, small though it was. "Tell her thank you." "I'm honored." After they had eaten, James explained as best he could that they needed to leave soon. "There's a place west of here, friends who can help us. But it's far, and the journey will be difficult." Sarah's face hardened. "We stay with our people." "Sarah," James said gently, "your people. There's no one left at the camp, And if there were survivors, they'd have been taken to the reservation. Her eyes flashed with anger. Then we go to make a reservation. The soldiers who attacked your camp will be there. They'll recognize you. James hesitated before adding, and they'll take Hannah from you. Sarah's arms instinctively tightened around her daughter. What do you mean, take? The army has orders to send Indian children to schools far away, to teach them to... He couldn't finish, ashamed of policies he'd silently disagreed with but never opposed. To kill the Indian, save the man. Sarah finished for him, her voice flat. She had clearly heard the infamous phrase before. No, not Hannah. She looked down at her daughter, signing rapidly. Hannah's eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. My friend's name is Michael Tucker, James explained. He left the army 5 years ago. His wife is Shoshone. They live in a valley in the mountains where the army doesn't patrol. They could help you reach other Cheyenne who've gone north. Sarah's expression remained skeptical, but James could see the calculation behind her eyes. Finally, she asked, How far? 6 days on horseback, if the weather holds, longer in this snow and with your injury. Sarah was silent for a long moment, communing with Hannah through their private language of gestures. James waited, knowing this decision couldn't be rushed or forced. Finally, Sarah met his gaze. We go with you, but I will keep this. She reached beneath her dress and withdrew a small knife she must have kept hidden. For protection, James nodded, respecting her caution. For protection, he agreed. They set out an hour later, James having fashioned a travois to pull behind his horse. He'd initially suggested Sarah and Hannah ride while he walked, but Sarah had refused, insisting that if they were pursued, his strength would be needed. Instead, she and Hannah rode on the travois, bundled in every blanket James could find, while he led the horse through the deep snow. As they left the cabin behind, James cast one backward glance at the smoke still rising from the chimney, knowing it might draw attention. But the cold was the more immediate threat, and he'd needed to ensure Sarah and Hannah were warm before the journey. The morning passed in silence, save for the crunch of snow beneath the horses' hooves and the occasional instructions James offered when the terrain grew difficult. Hannah remained watchful, her eyes taking in everything, while Sarah drifted between alertness and the fevered sleep of the wounded. By midday, the clouds had broken, revealing a brilliant blue sky that reflected blindingly off the snow. James pulled his hat low to shield his eyes and checked on his companions. Hannah was awake, her small face peeking out from the blankets, her breath forming tiny clouds in the cold air. She didn't smile. James had yet to see her smile, but there was something like curiosity in her gaze now as she watched a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. James pointed to the bird. "Hawk," he said, then looked questioningly at Hannah, wondering if she could read lips. The girl studied his face, then made a sweeping motion with her arm that mimicked the bird's flight. James copied the gesture, and Hannah nodded, her expression serious, but somehow approving. "You're teaching me," James said, smiling despite the gravity of their situation. "Thank you." Sarah stirred then, her eyes finding James. "She knows many signs," she said, her voice weakened by fever. "From both worlds, Cheyenne signs, white man signs, mission teacher taught her before." She trailed off, and James understood. There were stories still untold. "She's very smart," James said, checking Sarah's forehead with the back of his hand. The fever wasn't dangerously high yet, but it concerned him. "We'll stop soon to rest and check your wound." They found shelter that afternoon in a stand of pines where the snow wasn't as deep. James cleared a space while Sarah watched Hannah explore the small clearing, always keeping within arm's reach of her mother. The child moved with a stillness unusual for one so young, her feet making almost no sound in the snow. As James changed Sarah's bandages, he noticed a necklace she wore, a leather cord from which hung a small pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. "Medicine?" he asked, gesturing to it. Sarah's hand closed protectively around the pouch. "Sacred bundle," she said. "From my grandmother, keeps Hannah safe." James nodded, understanding its importance. After rebandaging the wound, he offered Sarah another dose of laudanum, which she accepted reluctantly. "For the journey," she conceded. "Need strength." As the medication took effect, Sarah motioned Hannah to her side and signed something that made the child's eyes widen. Then Hannah approached James, who had been boiling snow for drinking water, and deliberately sat across from him. From within her dress, she produced a small object, a carved wooden horse no bigger than her palm. She held it out to James with a solemn ceremony. Surprised, he accepted it carefully, turning the detailed carving in his hands. "Thank you, Hannah," he said, exaggerating his lip movements in case she could read them. "It's beautiful." Hannah pointed to the carving, then to herself, then made a series of gestures that James couldn't interpret. "She says her father made it," Sarah explained from where she rested. "Before soldiers came for the first time, when she was a baby." James looked at the small carving with new reverence, understanding it was perhaps the only memento Hannah had of her father. "I can't take this," he said, trying to return it. But Hannah shook her head firmly, closing his fingers around the horse. Then she pointed to him and made the sign he now recognized as his name. "Thinking Heart." Sarah's voice was edged with both pain and pride. "She gives a gift for helping." "It is a great honor. You insult yourself if you refuse." Humbled, James tucked the carving carefully into his breast pocket. "Tell her I'll keep it safe always." That night, as Sarah slept and Hannah lay curled beside her, James kept watch, the wooden horse in his hands. He'd spent 20 years in the army, moving from one frontier post to another, patching up soldiers and occasionally treating the indigenous people brought in under duress. He'd seen the toll of the government's policies, the reservations where proud people withered from disease and starvation, the children torn from families to be civilized in distant schools. He'd done nothing to stop it, focusing narrowly on his medical duties while ignoring the greater injustice. Even after losing his own family, after experiencing that gut-wrenching severance, he hadn't made the connection to what was being done to thousands of other families. Now, watching Hannah's small chest rise and fall, he felt shame burn through him. This child had lost everything, her father, her home, her tribe, and might well have lost her mother had James not intervened. Yet she had given him her most precious possession as thanks for doing the bare minimum of human decency. In the flickering light of their small fire, James made a silent vow. Whatever happened, he would ensure these two survived. Not just survived, but found a place where they could live with dignity. He knew the odds were stacked against them, 3 fugitives crossing contested territory in winter. But for the first time in years, he had a purpose worth the risk. Dawn of the second day brought wind that cut through their clothes and drove icy particles against any exposed skin. James fashioned a better covering for the travois using pine boughs and his own coat, leaving himself vulnerable to the elements but ensuring Sarah and Hannah remained as protected as possible. By mid-morning, they reached a ridge overlooking a broad valley, and James halted abruptly. In the distance, a thin column of riders moved across the snow-covered landscape. A cavalry patrol, too far to identify but certainly looking for someone. "We need to change direction," James said, turning the horse eastward. "There are soldiers ahead." Sarah pushed herself up on the travois, wincing with the effort. "Looking for us? Maybe. Or maybe doing a regular patrol." James didn't believe that for a moment, and from Sarah's expression, neither did she. "Either way, we can't risk it." They skirted the ridge, using the tree line for cover, adding miles to their journey, but avoiding detection. The detour took them near a frozen creek where James spotted tracks that made his heart sink. Not cavalry, but something potentially more dangerous. Hunters, Sarah said, reading the signs in the snow with practiced ease despite her weakened state. 3 men, James nodded grimly. Trappers, maybe, or bounty hunters. Both possibilities were equally concerning. The frontier attracted men who operated outside the law, men who wouldn't hesitate to turn in, or worse, a Cheyenne woman and child, for whatever reward they might bring. We move fast, Sarah decided, her face set with determination. Night. Travel. James wanted to protest. Night travel in this cold was dangerous, especially with Sarah's wound. But the alternative could be worse. All right. But you need to stay warm and rested until then. They found shelter in a rocky outcropping where James was able to build a fire within a natural chamber that largely concealed the smoke. As Sarah slept, regaining strength for the night journey ahead, Hannah sat beside James, watching as he sketched a rough map in the dirt floor. "We're here," he explained, though he wasn't sure how much she understood. "We need to get here. To Michael's place." He drew an X far to the west. "But there are soldiers here and hunters here." He indicated the areas with slashes. Hannah studied the map intently, then picked up the stick and deliberately drew another route. A curving line that followed what appeared to be a series of ridges James hadn't considered. Startled, he looked at the child with new appreciation. "You know another way?" Hannah nodded solemnly, then made a sinuous motion with her hand and pointed to the curve she'd drawn. "River?" James guessed. When Hannah shook her head, he tried again. "Trail?" The girl touched her nose, confirming his guess, then added more details to the map. Small X marks that might indicate shelters or landmarks. "Hannah," James said slowly, "have you been to the mountains before?" Hannah nodded again, then touched her mother's arm gently, signing something that included the sweeping gesture for long ago that James had learned. Sarah stirred, her eyes focusing with effort. "Before reservation," she explained, her voice thick with sleep. "My mother's people lived near mountains. Hannah was born there." James looked back at the map with renewed interest. "She remembers. The trails. She remembers everything," Sarah said simply. "Sees once, knows forever. Gift from Creator." Hannah's route, if accurate, would take them through more difficult terrain, but away from the likely patrol paths and hunting grounds. It would require an additional day at least, but offered better concealment. "Are you certain, Hannah?" James asked, meeting her serious gaze. "It's very important." The child nodded once, firmly, then touched James's pocket where she knew the wooden horse resided. The message was clear. She trusted him with her father's carving. He could trust her with their path. "All right then," James said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "You'll guide us, Hannah." That night, under a sky ablaze with stars and a waning moon that provided just enough light to see by, the unlikely trio set out along Hannah's route. The child sat with James atop the horse now, pointing the way with small, decisive gestures, while Sarah followed on the travois, wrapped in every blanket they had. The path took them through narrow draws and along frozen riverbeds where the snow wasn't as deep, allowing for easier travel. Twice, Hannah signaled for James to stop and listen, her small body tensing as she detected sounds his adult ears missed. The distant crack of a rifle, the howl of wolves that seemed to follow their progress. By dawn, they had covered more ground than James had thought possible, and Hannah directed them to a sheltered overhang where several large boulders created a natural windbreak. As James helped Sarah from the travois, he noticed her fever had worsened, her skin hot to the touch, despite the freezing air. "We need to rest longer here," he said, concerned with sharpening his voice. "Your wound—" "No," Sarah interrupted, her eyes clear despite the fever. Keep moving. Feel something." She didn't need to finish. James had felt it too, a growing sense of unease, as though they were being watched or followed. Hannah's exceptional alertness confirmed his suspicions. The child kept looking back the way they had come, her small face tight with anxiety. As James prepared a small fire to warm some broth for Sarah, he found himself studying Hannah more carefully. In the soft light of dawn, with her guard momentarily lowered, she looked like any exhausted child, small and vulnerable, her eyes heavy with fatigue. Yet there was a resilience in her that defied her years, a quiet strength that reminded James of his own son in his final days. Thomas had been just 16 when he lied about his age to join the Union Army, determined to fight for a cause he barely understood. James had been stationed at a field hospital in Virginia and hadn't known his son was even in the state until the boy was brought in on a stretcher, his chest torn open by Confederate grapeshot. "Dad," Thomas had whispered, somehow finding strength to smile through his pain. "Guess I followed you after all." Those were the last words James heard his son speak. Thomas had died during the night, one of thousands lost in the meaningless slaughter of Cold Harbor. Caroline, already weakened by consumption, had followed 6 months later, leaving James utterly alone. Now, watching Hannah doze against her mother's side, James felt a familiar ache. The girl had Hannah's age, her entire life stretched before her, yet fate had already dealt her a cruel hand. Born unable to hear, witness to massacre, forced to flee the only home she'd known. "What will you do?" James asked Sarah softly, helping her sip the warm broth. "After we reach Michael's place?" Sarah's gaze remained fixed on her daughter. "Find our people, those who went north, beyond soldiers' reach." James nodded, understanding the desire to return to community, to the familiar. "Hannah is special," he said after a moment. "She sees things others miss." "Is blessing and danger," Sarah replied, a shadow crossing her face. "Some fear what they don't understand." Call her spirit-touched. James thought of the medical texts he'd read about deafness, the clinical descriptions that failed to capture the unique ways a deaf child might perceive the world. Hannah's silence wasn't emptiness, but a different way of experiencing life, one that, in this moment, might be keeping all three of them alive. "She's extraordinary," he said simply. Sarah studied him, her fevered eyes surprisingly lucid. "You lost a child," she said. Not a question, but a statement. James's breath caught. "My son, in the war." Sarah nodded as if this confirmed something. "Hannah knew. Said your heart carries shadow." Before James could respond, Hannah suddenly sat upright, her entire body alert. She made a quick, urgent gesture to her mother, who immediately tensed. "What is it?" James asked, reaching for his rifle. "Riders," Sarah whispered, "coming fast." James moved with practiced efficiency, extinguishing the small fire with snow while scanning their surroundings for the best escape route. The overhang that had offered shelter now felt like a trap, with only one clear path leading away from it. Hannah tugged at her mother's sleeve, her small hands flying in a series of urgent signs. Sarah's expression tightened. "Not soldiers," she translated for James. "Hunters, 4 men." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Bounty hunters or trappers in these territories were often more dangerous than military patrols, men who lived by their own brutal code, unconstrained by even the loose discipline of the army. "Can you ride?" he asked Sarah, already knowing the answer but hoping nonetheless. She shook her head, her breathing labored from fever. "Take Hannah. Go." "I'm not leaving you," James said firmly, helping her to her feet. "We stay together." The sound of approaching horses grew louder. There was no time to hitch the travois again. James made a quick decision, lifting Sarah in his arms despite her weak protests. "Hannah," he said, Can you climb onto the horse by yourself?" The girl nodded, already moving toward the animal with surprising agility. James helped Sarah onto the saddle, then lifted Hannah up in front of her. "Hold tight to your mother," he instructed, using exaggerated gestures to ensure Hannah understood. "I'll lead on foot." They moved away from the overhang, keeping to the tree line where the snow was shallower and their tracks less obvious. James led the horse deeper into the forest, away from the path they'd been following. It was slow, exhausting work, breaking trail through knee-deep snow while guiding a horse carrying 2 riders, but the thickness of the trees offered concealment they desperately needed. After nearly an hour of grueling progress, Hannah tapped her mother's arm and pointed to a barely visible game trail that curved up a steep hillside. Sarah relayed the suggestion to James, who hesitated only briefly before turning the horse in that direction. Hannah's instincts had proven reliable thus far. He trusted the child's uncanny awareness of their surroundings. The trail wound upward through increasingly dense pine forest, occasionally offering glimpses of the valley below. During one such clearing, James spotted the riders, 4 men on horseback, spread out as they followed the original path. 3 carried rifles, while the 4th had what appeared to be tracking dogs on leads. They hadn't yet noticed the change in direction, but the dogs would eventually pick up their scent. "We need to find water," James muttered, more to himself than his companions. Running water might help confuse the dog's sense of smell, giving them precious time. Hannah, ever watchful, made a flowing motion with her hand, then pointed further up the hillside. Sarah, weakened by fever and the jostling ride, managed to translate, "Stream ahead." The child's knowledge of this terrain continued to amaze James. Perhaps her inability to hear had indeed sharpened her other senses, as he'd read in medical journals. Or perhaps it was simply that Hannah possessed an exceptional memory for landscapes. Either way, her guidance had become their greatest asset. They found the stream, little more than a trickle of water flowing beneath a crust of ice, a quarter-mile farther. James broke through the ice and led the horse directly into the shallow water, wincing as the freezing current soaked through his boots. They followed the stream for nearly half a mile before emerging onto rocky ground that would leave minimal tracks. By mid-afternoon, the immediate threat had passed, but exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. James's legs burned from breaking trail, and Sarah's condition had deteriorated, her skin flushed with fever despite the cold. Only Hannah seemed to maintain her strength, her dark eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for danger or opportunity. They needed shelter, not just for rest, but to properly tend to Sarah's wound before infection took a deadly hold. As if reading his thoughts, Hannah tapped her mother's arm and made a series of signs that caused Sarah to straighten slightly. "Hannah knows the place," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Not far. Safe." James looked at the child, questioningly. "A place to rest, with shelter?" Hannah nodded emphatically, then made a sign he'd come to recognize as "trust me." James didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." The place Hannah led them to exceeded James's expectations. Nestled in a protected hollow 2 miles further into the hills, stood a small structure, not quite a cabin, but sturdier than a lean-to. Built against the side of a rock face and partially dug into the hillside, it appeared to be a hunting blind or trapper's shelter, long abandoned but still offering solid protection from the elements. Inside, they found a stone hearth, a rough wooden platform that served as a bed, and even a small cache of firewood, dry and protected. Most surprisingly, the interior showed signs of recent use, not by white trappers, but by indigenous people. A medicine wheel had been painted on. One wall and hanging from the low ceiling were several small bundles of dried herbs. "Cheyenne?" James asked, watching as Sarah's expression shifted from exhaustion to cautious hope. She shook her head. "Crow. Friendly to my mother's family." She touched one of the herb bundles gently. Medicine left for travelers. Sacred place. James felt a surge of relief. If this was indeed a shelter used by crow hunters or travelers, it was unlikely the bounty hunters would know of it. And if the place was considered sacred, perhaps they had found not just physical shelter, but spiritual protection as well. He helped Sarah onto the sleeping platform while Hannah immediately set about gathering what they needed: melting snow, for water, arranging the firewood, even finding a small cache of pemmican stored in a birch container. Again, James marveled at the child's self-sufficiency, wondering what experiences had shaped her into such a capable young person. With shelter secured, James turned his full attention to Sarah's wound. The bandage was soaked through with a mixture of blood and yellowish fluid, a sign the infection was worsening. He worked carefully, cleaning the wound with melted snow water boiled with pine needles for their medicinal properties, a frontier remedy he'd learned from an old scout years ago. Sarah watched him through half-lidded eyes, occasionally translating his movements into sign for Hannah, who hovered nearby, her small face etched with worry. "The bullet didn't hit anything vital," James explained as he worked, "but the cold and exertion have aggravated the wound. You need rest, real rest, not just a few hours." "How long?" Sarah asked, wincing as he applied a fresh bandage. "At least 2 days," James said, knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "Any less and you risk collapse before we reach Michael's place?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Hunters will not stop." "Maybe not, but they'll have a hard time tracking us through yesterday's snowfall, and harder still finding this place." James gestured to the shelter around them. Hannah chose well. At the mention of her name, Hannah looked up from where she sat cross-legged near the fire. She signed something to her mother, who managed a weak smile in response. "What did she say?" James asked, curious about their private communications. "She says spirits guided her," Sarah translated, "says her father's ghost walks with us." James glanced at Hannah with new understanding. The wooden horse carving, the child's connection to places she seemingly couldn't have known. Perhaps these were ways she maintained a bond with her lost father. Who was he to question such beliefs? His own faith had been shattered by war and personal loss, but he respected the comfort others found in their traditions. "Then we're fortunate to have such guidance," he said sincerely. That night, as Sarah, who fell into a fitful sleep aided by the last of James's laudanum, Hannah remained awake, sitting beside her mother as if standing guard. James tended the fire, occasionally casting glances at the child who seemed determined to fight exhaustion. "You should rest too," he said eventually, exaggerating his lip movements and miming sleep. Hannah shook her head stubbornly. Pointing to her mother and then to her own eyes, she would watch over Sarah. James moved to sit beside her, close but not touching, respecting the invisible boundary the child maintained with everyone save her mother. For several minutes, they sat in companionable silence, the crackling fire the only sound. Finally, James reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden horse Hannah had given him. He held it in his open palm, where she could see it, then pointed to it questioningly, hoping she might share more about its significance. Hannah studied him for a moment, then slowly reached out and traced the carving with one finger. She made a series of signs too complex for James to follow without Sarah's translation, but the longing in her expression transcended language. James tried a different approach. He pantomimed carving, then pointed to Hannah questioningly. Did her father make other things? The girl's face brightened slightly. She nodded, then mimed drawing or writing. James reached for his medical bag and withdrew a small notebook and pencil he used for patient records. He offered them to Hannah, who accepted with surprising eagerness. For the next hour, as the fire burned low and wind whistled outside their shelter, Hannah drew. Her small hands worked with remarkable precision, creating detailed sketches of people and places. A man with kind eyes and strong hands, a circle of lodges beside a river, mountains rising in the distance. Her world, as it had been before the soldiers came. James watched in astonishment. He'd known deaf children were often visual thinkers. His medical training had taught him that much. But Hannah's artistic ability surpassed anything he'd expected from a child so young. Each drawing told a story, capturing moments from a life now violently disrupted. When Hannah finally succumbed to sleep, curled against her mother's side with the notebook clutched to her chest, James remained awake, turning the wooden horse in his hands. He thought about the man who had carved it, Hannah's father, whom he would never meet but whose legacy lived on in this extraordinary child. For the first time in years, James felt the weight of solitude lift slightly. He had been alone since Caroline and Thomas died, moving through life like a ghost, present but not participating. Now, improbably, he found himself responsible for two lives, connected to their fates in ways he couldn't have imagined days ago. Dawn brought clearing skies and bitter cold. James ventured outside briefly to gather more snow for water and to check for signs of pursuit. The surrounding forest lay silent under a fresh dusting of snow, and the only tracks visible were those of deer and smaller wildlife. For the moment, at least, they were safe. Inside the shelter he found Sarah awake, her fever slightly reduced. Hannah slept on, exhaustion finally claiming her after days of vigilance. "She showed you her drawings," Sarah said, nodding toward the notebook that had fallen open beside Hannah, revealing a sketch of what appeared to be a Cheyenne ceremony. "She's remarkably talented," James replied, helping Sarah sit up and offering her water. "Did her father teach her to draw as well as carve?" Sarah's expression softened with memory. "Matthew taught her many things. He was a medicine man, but also an artist, saw the world differently." She paused, stroking Hannah's hair. "Like Hannah." James hesitated before asking his next question. "Matthew was white?" Sarah nodded. "Came to study our ways, to learn healing plants, ceremonies. Stayed for love." Her eyes met James's, challenging him to judge. Some called him deserter, traitor. Some called me worse. James thought of the prejudice a mixed couple would have faced from both worlds, white society and tribal community alike. It couldn't have been easy for either of you. "Worth every hardship," Sarah said simply. "He gave me Hannah. Taught me English, writing. I taught him Cheyenne ways, heart speak." She touched her chest. "We made a bridge between worlds." "What happened to him?" James asked gently. Sarah's face darkened. "First soldier raid 3 winters ago. They burned the medicine lodge with Matthew inside. Said he stole army property." Her voice turned bitter. "Paper, pencils he used for drawing. Plants." Hannah stirred in her sleep, as if sensing the painful conversation. Sarah immediately switched to humming softly, a melody that seemed to soothe the child even though she couldn't hear it. Perhaps, James thought, she could feel the vibrations of her mother's voice, a connection that transcended sound. "I'm sorry," James said, the words inadequate but sincere. "About Matthew, about all of it." Sarah studied him, her gaze penetrating. "Why do you help us, really? Not just Dr. Mercy." James considered the question, knowing he owed her honesty. "At first, it was guilt," he admitted, "for being part of the army that's destroyed so many lives, for not speaking out against injustice. And now. James glanced at Hannah's sleeping form. "Now it's because I see 2 people worth saving, worth fighting for. I've been empty since losing my family. Perhaps helping you and Hannah is a way to find purpose again." Sarah accepted this with a nod. "Honest answer. What about you?" James asked. "Why trust me? I wear the uniform of men who killed your husband, your people." "Not trust the uniform," Sarah replied. "Trust your eyes. Trust hands that heal, not harm." She gestured to her bandaged side. "And Hannah trusts you. She sees true heart." Their conversation was interrupted by Hannah waking, instantly alert, as was her way. She signed a morning greeting to her mother, then turned to James with a nod that felt like acceptance. From her pocket, she withdrew a small object, a beautifully polished stone of deep blue streaked with white. She offered it to James solemnly. "Rare." "Gift," Sarah explained, her voice tinged with surprise. "Medicine stone, from her father's pouch." James accepted the stone reverently, understanding its significance. "Thank you, Hannah," he said, forming the sign for thank you that he'd learned from watching them. Hannah's response was unexpected, a small but genuine smile, the first James had seen from her. It transformed her solemn face, revealing the child beneath the survivor. They spent the day resting and preparing for the journey ahead. James checked and cleaned Sarah's wound again, relieved to find the infection receding. Hannah surprised them by discovering a cache of dried meat and wild onions hidden in a rock crevice inside the shelter, another gift from previous inhabitants. As Sarah's strength improved, she taught James more sign language, translating Hannah's rapid gestures and correcting his awkward attempts to reply. It became a kind of game, with Hannah occasionally giggling silently at James's mistakes, her initial wariness giving way to cautious acceptance. By evening, a new rhythm had established itself between them. Not quite family, but something more than strangers thrown together by circumstance. James found himself smiling more than he had in years, especially when Hannah took it upon herself to reorganize his medical supplies according to some system only she understood. "She likes order," Sarah explained, watching her daughter meticulously arrange bandages by size. "Makes the world make sense when nothing else does." James understood the impulse all too well. His own medical training had been a refuge during the chaos of war, procedures and protocols to follow when everything else fell apart. Perhaps Hannah's attention to detail served a similar purpose, creating islands of control in a life marked by upheaval. As night fell, James studied the rough map he'd drawn based on Hannah's guidance and his own knowledge of the territory. They were approximately 3 days from Michael Tucker's homestead, assuming good weather and no further complications. Sarah's improved condition meant they could travel faster, but James remained concerned about the hunters who had nearly found them. "We should avoid open ground," he said, tracing a route along a series of ridgelines. "It will be harder going, but provides better cover." Sarah nodded agreement, then translated for Hannah, who studied the map with her characteristic intensity, before adding several marks of her own. Places to find water, a canyon to avoid, a stand of trees that would offer good shelter. Again, James marveled at the child's detailed mental map of territory she'd traversed perhaps only once before. "We leave at first light," Sarah decided. "Hunters may have lost trail, but not given up. Too much money for Indian scalps." The brutal reality of her words hung in the air. Bounties for indigenous people, officially discontinued but still paid under the table by certain territorial officials and ranchers, remained a grim reality of frontier life. James had treated the victims of scalp hunters before, those few who survived, and the memory turned his stomach. "I won't let that happen," he said, the promise fierce and unexpected even to himself. "We'll reach Michael's place safely. All of us." Sarah held his gaze, reading the determination there. "Good," she said simply. "Hannah needs more people who make such promises and keep them." Later, as Sarah and Hannah slept side by side on the platform bed, James stood at the shelter's entrance, gazing at stars so bright and numerous they seemed close enough to touch. The cold air burned his lungs, a clarifying pain that matched his sharpened resolve. 3 days earlier, he had been a man drifting through life, detached from everything and everyone. Now he found himself at the center of a desperate journey, responsible for lives that had somehow become precious to him. The wooden horse in one pocket, the blue stone in the other, tangible reminders of trust placed in him against all odds. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonesome sound that echoed across the mountains. Another answered, then another, the calls overlapping in a wild harmony that made James think of Hannah's silent world. Perhaps her perception wasn't defined by absence, but by presence, seeing what others missed, feeling what others ignored, understanding through means beyond ordinary senses. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey west, toward whatever awaited them in the mountain valley, where Michael and his Shoshone wife had made their home. James couldn't know if they would find sanctuary there, or if the hunters would pick up their trail again, or if Sarah's wound would heal completely. But for the first time since watching his son's life slip away on a Virginia field hospital cot, Dr. James Holloway felt something like hope stirring within him, fragile but undeniable. Not hope for himself, necessarily, but for the sleeping child, whose extraordinary resilience had awakened something he thought long dead. He touched the blue stone in his pocket, smooth and cool against his fingertips. Whatever came next, he was no longer alone. The fourth day of their journey dawned with an ominous sky, heavy clouds pressing down on the mountains like a leaden blanket. James studied the weather with growing concern. Snow was coming, not the light dusting of previous days, but a proper storm that could strand them far from shelter. "We need to cover as much ground as possible before it hits," he told Sarah, as they prepared to leave the sacred shelter that had protected them through the night. Sarah nodded, her strength notably improved, but still far from fully recovered. "Half-day journey to the next safe place," she said, relaying information Hannah had provided through her signs. "Old trading post. Abandoned now." James secured their few provisions while Hannah carefully erased all signs of their presence inside. The shelter, a precaution that spoke of hard-learned lessons about pursuit and survival. The child moved with quiet efficiency, even placing the remaining firewood exactly as they had found it, maintaining the balance of give and take that governed her people's relationship with sacred places. Once mounted on the horse, with Sarah, holding Hannah before her on the saddle, they set out along a narrow ridge that offered both concealment and a clear view of the valleys below. The wind had picked up, carrying the bite of approaching snow, and James pulled his hat lower against the sting. "Your friend?" Sarah asked, as they navigated a particularly steep section. "This Michael. Can we truly trust him?" The question wasn't surprising. After all they'd been through, caution was warranted. Michael Tucker was a scout for the Army for 15 years, James explained, but he grew disillusioned with military campaigns against peaceful tribes. The final straw came when he fell in love with Waking Dove, a Shoshone woman whose village had been displaced by settlers. "He left the Army for her?" Sarah asked, a note of skepticism in her voice. "He did, though it wasn't that simple." James guided the horse around a fallen tree. Michael was court-martialed for refusing orders during a raid on a Shoshone camp. He would have been imprisoned if not for the intervention of an officer who respected his scouting abilities. Instead, he was discharged without honors. James had met Michael during that tumultuous period, treating injuries the scout had sustained while trying to warn the Shoshone village of the impending attack. Despite James's uniform, Michael had seen something in him worth trusting, perhaps the same quality that had led Sarah and Hannah to place their lives in his hands. After his discharge, Michael and Waking Dove traveled west, finally settling in a remote valley far from both army patrols and tribal conflicts. They've created something rare out there, a place where different worlds meet in peace. Hannah, who had been watching James's lips as he spoke, made a series of signs to her. "Mother." She asks if other children live there, Sarah translated. Yes, James replied directly to Hannah, making sure his face was visible to her. Michael and Waking Dove have 2 sons, and I believe other families have joined them over the years. People seeking refuge from violence on both sides. This information seemed to satisfy Hannah, who nodded thoughtfully before returning her attention to the landscape ahead. James wondered if she was thinking about the possibility of other children who might understand her unique way of perceiving the world. By midday, the temperature had dropped dramatically, and the first snowflakes began to swirl around them. James increased their pace, knowing they needed to reach the abandoned trading post before the full force of the storm hit. They were crossing an exposed stretch of high ground when Hannah suddenly stiffened, clutching her mother's arm. The child's entire body tensed like a bowstring, her eyes fixed on something in the valley below. James followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. Riders, at least 3 of them, with dogs running alongside, were moving along the base of the ridge, following what must be their trail from the previous day's journey. The hunters, he breathed, instinctively pulling the horse into the shelter of a stand of stunted pines. They're closer than I thought. Sarah's arms tightened around Hannah protectively. They have a good tracker with them. Professional. James watched as the lead rider dismounted to examine something on the ground, then pointed up toward the ridge, where they now hid. The hunters hadn't spotted them yet, but they were following their trail with unnerving accuracy despite the confusing tactics James had employed. "We can't outrun them," he said grimly, "not with all 3 of us on one horse." Sarah met his eyes, understanding immediately what he was suggesting. "We do not separate. It may be the only way." James helped them dismount, guiding the horse deeper into the pines where it wouldn't be visible from below. "I can lead them away while you and Hannah continue to the trading post. Once there, you'll be sheltered until I can circle back." "Too dangerous," Sarah argued, though James could see the calculation behind her eyes, weighing their limited options. "No more dangerous than all of us being caught in the open when they reach this ridge," James countered. "You know I'm right." Sarah? Hannah, who had been watching their exchange intently, suddenly tugged at her mother's dress and signed rapidly, her small face intense with purpose. Sarah's expression changed as she watched her daughter's hands. "Hannah says there is another way, a hidden path through the rocks, too narrow for horses but safe for walking. Leads directly to the trading post." James looked at the child with renewed wonder. "Are you certain, Hannah?" The girl nodded emphatically, then pointed to a seemingly solid rock face about 50 yards ahead. James had to trust her, even though he could see no path from this distance. "Show us," he said. Hannah led them to what appeared to be an unremarkable section of the ridgeline, but upon closer inspection revealed a narrow fissure between towering rocks, a crevice just wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. Beyond the opening lay a path that twisted downward through a labyrinth of stone, invisible from both the ridgetop and the valley below. "Remarkable," James murmured, understanding how generations of native people had used such hidden routes to evade enemies and navigate through otherwise impassable terrain. The path, however, presented a new problem. "The horse can't follow," he said, stating the obvious. Sarah nodded grimly. "Must let it go, no choice." James hesitated, calculating the impact of losing their only mount. Without the horse, their journey would take significantly longer, and Sarah's wound might not withstand the additional strain of walking for days through mountain terrain. But the sound of the dogs baying closer decided the matter. James quickly removed everything essential from the saddlebags, medical supplies, the remaining food, blankets, and distributed the items between the 3 of them. He slipped the bridle from the horse and gave the animal a sharp slap on the flank, sending it running along the ridgeline away from their position. "That should confuse the dogs, at least temporarily," he said, watching as the horse disappeared into the thickening snowfall. Let's move. The hidden path proved as challenging as it appeared, requiring them to navigate narrow passages where the stone walls pressed in from both sides. In some places, they had to remove their packs and push them ahead before squeezing through particularly tight spots. For Hannah, the smallest of them, the journey was easiest, and she moved with the confidence of someone following a known route. "Has Hannah been this way before?" James asked Sarah as they paused to rest in a small opening between rock walls. Sarah shook her head. "Not here exactly, but her father." She hesitated, then continued. "Matthew taught her to read stone, to see paths others miss, said it was her special medicine." James nodded, thinking of the medical texts he'd read about compensation, how the loss of one sense often led to remarkable development in others. But Hannah's abilities seemed to go beyond heightened vision or touch. She possessed an intuitive understanding of the landscape that bordered on the extraordinary. The snow fell heavier now, blown into swirling eddies by the wind that found its way even into their stone corridor. Despite the discomfort, James realized the storm worked in their favor, obscuring any tracks they might leave and making pursuit increasingly difficult for the hunters. They had been following the hidden path for nearly 2 hours when Hannah suddenly halted, raising one hand in a silent command to stop. James froze, straining his ears for whatever might have alerted the child. At first, he heard only the moan of wind through stone, but then a voice carried on the gusting air, words indistinct but unmistakably human. Hannah pointed upward, where the rock walls opened slightly, revealing a slice of grey sky. The voices were coming from above. The hunters must have reached the spot where they'd entered the hidden path. "They found the opening," James whispered, pulling Sarah and Hannah deeper into the shadows of an overhanging rock. The voices grew louder, an argument taking shape. "Waste of time. The tracks show they went east with the horse. The dogs say something different, and I trust a hound's nose over a horse's hoofprints in half-covered snow. They're down there somewhere." That crack barely wide enough for a child, let alone a grown man. The Cheyenne woman with her kid. Army surgeon could have stayed with the horse, planning to meet up later. The debate continued, but the storm seemed to intensify, the wind carrying away further words. James, Sarah, and Hannah remained motionless, barely breathing as they waited to learn whether the hunters would attempt to follow them down the narrow path. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, the voices faded, either moved away by the hunters or simply swallowed by the growing storm. Still, they waited, Hannah's small hand gripping James's coat with surprising strength. When it seemed safe to move again, they continued their descent, the path growing steeper and more treacherous as ice formed on the stone. Sarah struggled with her injury, and James found himself supporting more of her weight with each step. Hannah forged ahead, occasionally pausing to ensure they were keeping pace, her expression a mix of determination and concern for her mother. Just as dusk began to settle over the mountains, turning the grey day to deepening charcoal, the stone corridor widened suddenly, opening onto a small plateau. Beyond it, barely visible through the curtain of snow, stood a squat, dark structure, the abandoned trading post. "We made it," James said, relief washing through him. "Hannah, you were right." The child allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction before tugging them toward the promise of shelter. The trading post proved to be in better condition than James had expected, its log walls weathered but solid, the roof mostly intact, save for one corner where snow drifted in through missing shingles. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and rough-hewn shelves and counters spoke of its former purpose as a place of commerce between worlds. Like the sacred shelter they'd found earlier, this place showed signs of occasional use by native travelers. A carefully stacked pile of firewood, a cache of dried foods wrapped in oiled skins, a bundle of herbs hanging from a roof beam. The frontier's unspoken code of survival. Take what you need, leave what you can for the next traveler in need. James quickly set about building a fire while Sarah sank onto a bench, exhaustion plain on her face. Hannah explored the single room structure methodically, discovering treasures with each circuit. A stack of battered metal cooking pots, a pile of furs that could serve as bedding, even a small store of candles. By the time flames were dancing in the hearth, casting warm light against the log walls, the worst of the storm had arrived. Wind howled around the trading post's corners, finding every crack and crevice, while snow piled against the single window so thickly that the glass disappeared entirely. "No one will follow our trail in this," James said, helping Sarah move closer. "To the fire. We're safe, at least until the storm passes." He checked her wound, concerned by the day's exertion, but found it remarkably well healed, a testament to both his care and Sarah's natural resilience. Hannah, meanwhile, had arranged the furs into 3 sleeping pallets near the fire and was now heating snowmelt water in one of the pots, adding dried meat and herbs to create a simple but nourishing broth. As they ate the warm meal, huddled around the fire with the storm raging outside, James felt an unexpected sense of contentment. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty that still lay ahead, there was something profoundly right about this moment. 3 people from different worlds finding common ground in survival and growing trust. "How much farther to your friends?" "Valley?" Sarah asked, sipping the broth that Hannah had prepared. 2 days in good weather," James replied. "Perhaps 3 or 4 with snow this deep." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Hunters may give up in a storm, return to the fort for new supplies." "They might," James agreed, though he wasn't convinced. Men who made their living hunting human beings were not easily discouraged, but we should be cautious nonetheless. Hannah, who had been sketching on the dirt floor with a stick, suddenly looked up and signed something that made Sarah's expression soften. "What did she say?" James asked. "She says the storm is grandfather's breath," Sarah translated. "Protecting us." The simple, poetic image reminded James of conversations with his own son, who had often anthropomorphized natural phenomena in similarly imaginative ways. Children, regardless of culture, seem to possess an innate ability to find meaning and pattern in the world around them. "Your grandfather watches over you, Hannah," James said, making sure the child could see his lips. "And so does your father." Hannah nodded solemnly, then resumed her drawing in the dirt, a series of connected circles and lines that James gradually recognized as a map. She was plotting their journey, from the site of the massacre to their current location, with remarkable accuracy for one so young. As the evening deepened and the fire settled into glowing embers, Sarah began to sing softly, a Cheyenne lullaby that, though Hannah couldn't hear it, seemed to soothe the child nonetheless. Perhaps it was the familiar sight of her mother singing, or perhaps she felt the vibrations somehow. Either way, Hannah's perpetual vigilance eased, her small shoulders relaxing as she leaned against Sarah's side. James watched them, struck by the resilience of this bond that had survived unimaginable trauma. In Sarah and Hannah, he witnessed something that had been missing from military campaigns and political policies regarding the Indian problem. The simple, profound humanity of the people being displaced and destroyed. "You should sleep," Sarah told him after Hannah had finally drifted off. "I will watch first." James wanted to protest that she needed rest more than he did, but the determined set of her jaw told him it would be futile. There was pride there, a need to contribute. Equally to their partnership despite her injury, he respected that too much to argue. "Wake me in 4 hours," he said instead, settling onto one of the fur pallets. As he drifted towards sleep, lulled by the crackling fire and the storm's muffled roar, James found himself thinking about what awaited them beyond this journey. Michael's Valley might offer temporary sanctuary, but what then? Sarah had spoken of finding Cheyenne who had gone north, beyond the reach of the army, but such places grew fewer with each passing year. And what of his own future? A court-martial surely awaited if his role in their escape became known. Yet, these concerns felt distant compared to the immediate reality of the small family sleeping nearby. Somehow, in the span of just 4 days, their survival had become more important to him than his own future prospects. He had started this journey out of guilt and a vague sense of redemption, but something deeper had taken root, a genuine care for Hannah and Sarah that transcended his original motivations. The dream came without warning, vivid and disorienting, as most battlefield nightmares were. He was back at Cold Harbor, knee-deep in mud and blood, searching desperately among fallen soldiers for his son. Only in the dream, it wasn't Thomas he found, but Hannah, small and silent among the dead. Her, dark eyes open and unseeing. James woke with a start, heart pounding, to find Hannah herself standing over him, her expression concerned. The trading post was dark save for the dying fire, and outside the storm continued to rage. Sarah slept nearby, finally surrendered to exhaustion, despite her intention to stand watch. Hannah signed something, then, realizing James couldn't understand in the dim light, simply pointed toward the door, her body tense with alarm. James listened, straining to hear anything unusual above the storm's fury. At first, there was nothing, but then a sound that didn't belong, metal striking wood, deliberate and searching. Someone was testing the door latch from outside. James rose silently, signaling Hannah to wake her mother. He moved toward the window, carefully scraping a small opening in the snow that covered it. Through the cleared space, he could make out a lantern's glow and the dark silhouette of a man standing at the trading post's entrance. "They found us," he whispered as Sarah joined him, Hannah clinging to her mother's side. "At least one of them. The others must be nearby." The latch rattled again, more insistently this time. If the hunters had tracked them through the blizzard to this remote location, they were dealing with men of exceptional determination. Or desperation. "The back wall," Sarah whispered, pointing to where the trading post backed against the hillside. "Has a root cellar. Hannah found it earlier." James nodded, gathering their few possessions as silently as possible, while Sarah and Hannah moved toward a trapdoor, half hidden beneath one of the rough-hewn counters. The cellar would provide temporary concealment, but if the hunters decided to search thoroughly or wait out the storm in the trading post, discovery was inevitable. The latch gave way with a crack that seemed deafening in the tense silence. James froze, watching as the door swung open, admitting a swirl of snow and the hulking figure of a man wrapped in furs. The hunter stamped his feet, shaking off snow, then raised his lantern to survey the interior. The light fell directly on James, who stood in the center of the room, deliberately placing himself between the hunter and the trapdoor, where Sarah and Hannah had disappeared moments before. "Well now," the man said, his voice gravelly with cold and surprise. "Wasn't expecting company." His free hand moved to the revolver at his hip. "Especially not from an army surgeon." James recognized the insignia on the man's buckskin jacket. A former army scout, likely turned bounty hunter, when the military presence in the territory contracted after the war. The type of man who knew how to track prey through any conditions, who wouldn't be deterred by storm or darkness. "I'm alone," James said evenly, praying the hunter wouldn't notice the remains of 3 meals by the fire or the 3 distinct sleeping pallets. "Lost my horse in the storm, found this place by luck." The hunter's eyes, sharp beneath a frost-crusted beard, scanned the trading post with practiced thoroughness. "Alone, huh? Then who's your invisible friend who built that fire and who cooked that meal?" He gestured toward the pot still hanging above the embers. "And why's a surgeon from Fort Laramie out here alone in Crow territory during a blizzard?" James said nothing, his mind racing for a plausible explanation that might salvage the situation. But the hunter's next words eliminated any hope of simple deception. "Listen, Doc, let's not waste time. We know you took the Cheyenne woman and her kid from that mess at Black Creek. Captain Williams wants them back, or proof they're dead. Hand them over, and maybe we won't report your involvement to the fort commander. There's no one here but me, James maintained, subtly shifting his position to block the hunter's view of the trapdoor. And I don't know anything about a Cheyenne. Woman or child, the hunter sighed, a sound of exaggerated patience. Have it your way. He turned slightly and called over his shoulder into the swirling snow. Silas! Found our army friend, and he's being uncooperative. A second figure appeared in the doorway, shorter but broader, with a face marked by a distinctive scar that split his right eyebrow. Well, well, Silas drawled, stepping inside and closing the door against the storm. If it ain't the good doctor himself. Captain Williams is mighty interested in having a word with you, sir. James felt the situation deteriorating rapidly. Two armed men, likely with more outside, against a wounded woman, a child, and himself with only a medical scalpel as a weapon. The odds were impossible. "Where's Davis and the dogs?" the first hunter asked. "Circling round back," Silas replied, his eyes never leaving James, making sure our quarry doesn't slip out while we're having this friendly chat. James's blood ran cold. If there was a hunter checking the rear of the trading post, he might discover the root cellar entrance from outside. Sarah and Hannah would be trapped with no escape. "The woman and child you're looking for aren't here," James said, abandoning the pretense of ignorance in favor of a new strategy, buying time. "I helped them reach Crow Village 2 days ago. They're probably halfway to Canada by now." Silas laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Nice try, Doc, but we've been tracking you since the shelter in the hills. 3 sets of tracks, heading this way. Storm slowed us down, but didn't throw us off." The first hunter moved closer, his lantern illuminating James's face. "Now, I don't particularly care about some squaw and her brat, but there's good money for bringing them in. So you can tell us where they're hiding, or we can tear this place apart board by board until we find them." James stood his ground, though he knew the situation was hopeless. Perhaps he could negotiate, offer money from his own savings in exchange for Sarah and Hannah's freedom. But even as the thought formed, he knew these men wouldn't settle for anything less than completing their assignment. "Last chance, Doc," Silas said, drawing his revolver and cocking it with deliberate slowness. "Where are they?" Before James could respond, a tremendous crash came from outside, followed by shouting and the panicked whinny of horses. Both hunters whirled toward the door, momentarily distracted. In that instant, the trapdoor flew open and Sarah emerged like an avenging spirit, wielding a rusted trader's axe she must have found in the cellar. With a cry that contained generations of defiance, she swung the weapon at the nearest hunter. The rusted axe caught the first hunter across the shoulder rather than the neck, as Sarah had clearly intended. He howled in pain, staggering backward as blood darkened his heavy coat. Silas swung his revolver toward her, but James lunged forward, tackling him with a ferocity born of desperation. The lantern crashed to the floor, its flame catching on a pile of dry kindling. Fire licked upward, casting manic shadows across the walls as the 4 adults grappled in the confined space of the trading post. James struggled with Silas, fighting for control of the revolver. Though younger and stronger, the bounty hunter hadn't expected such resistance from a military surgeon, and his momentary surprise gave James a crucial advantage. They crashed against the rough-hewn counter, sending dried goods and metal tools scattering across the floor. Sarah faced the wounded hunter, who had recovered enough to draw a wicked-looking knife from his belt. Despite her injury, she moved. With the fluid grace of a woman raised to hunt and defend, the axe gripped in both hands before her. "You'll pay for that, squaw," the hunter snarled, feinting left before slashing right. Sarah anticipated the move, stepping back just enough for the blade to miss her midsection. She countered with a swing of the axe that the hunter barely avoided. "My name is Sarah Blackfeather," she replied, her voice steady despite the exertion. "Remember it in hell." Outside, the commotion continued. Shouts, the panicked whinnies of horses, and a sound like thunder that seemed impossible in the dead of winter. Whatever had disrupted the hunter's companions was moving closer to the trading post. James managed to slam Silas's gun hand against the edge of the counter, forcing him to drop the revolver. It skittered across the floor, disappearing beneath. A tangle of furs, Silas responded by landing a devastating punch to James's ribs that drove the air from his lungs. "You're dead, Doc," Silas wheezed, blood streaming from his nose where James had landed a solid hit. "Dead as that deserter husband of hers." The taunt landed like a physical blow. James hadn't shared that particular detail with the hunters, which meant they'd been tracking Sarah specifically, not just any survivors from the massacre. This was personal, a vendetta disguised as official business. Before James could process this revelation, the trading post door burst open with a force that tore one hinge completely from the frame. A massive figure filled the doorway, backlit by the swirling snow. A man wrapped in buffalo robes, his face obscured by a heavy beard, frosted with ice. "Michael?" James gasped, recognizing his friend despite the years that had passed since they'd last met. Michael Tucker, former Army scout and the very man they'd been journeying to find, surveyed the chaotic scene with the practiced eye of a veteran frontiersman. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and brought the butt of his rifle down on Silas's head with a sickening crack. The bounty hunter crumpled to the floor, unconscious or worse. "James Holloway," Michael said, his deep voice remarkably calm given the circumstances. "When I saw army horses outside, I feared I'd find your corpse. Should have known you'd be in the middle of the fight instead." The wounded hunter, seeing his partner fall and faced with this new threat, abandoned his confrontation with Sarah and lunged for the door. Michael caught him by the collar, effortlessly lifting the smaller man off his feet. "Not so fast, Benson," Michael growled. "We've got unfinished business, you and I." The hunter, Benson, went still at the recognition, his face draining of color despite the blood loss from his shoulder wound. "Tucker, they said you were dead." "Rumors of my demise were greatly exaggerated," Michael replied, shoving Benson hard against the wall and binding his hands with practiced efficiency. "Though you'll wish I was, when the Crow warriors patrolling this ridge get their hands on you. Seems they're not too fond of men who hunt women and children for money." Only then did James notice the other figures entering the trading post. Two Crow men in winter garb, their faces painted for war despite the supposed peace between their tribe and the U.S. government. Behind them, a slight woman wrapped in a beaded blanket stepped into the firelight. "Waking dove," James breathed, recognizing Michael's Shoshone wife from the single time they'd met years earlier. She nodded in acknowledgement, but her attention was already focused on Sarah, who stood swaying with the axe still gripped in her hands, adrenaline clearly fading and pain returning. The two women regarded each other for a long moment, indigenous warriors from different tribes, survivors in a world increasingly hostile to their existence. Then Waking Dove spoke in the trade language common among the Plains tribes. Sarah's exhausted face softened at the familiar sounds, and she responded in kind. Whatever was said formed an immediate bond between them, the shared experiences of native women transcending tribal differences. A small movement near the overturned counter caught James's eye. Hannah emerged from her hiding place, her dark eyes taking in the crowded room with characteristic watchfulness. When she spotted the strangers, she froze, one hand instinctively reaching for the medicine pouch at her neck. Waking Dove noticed the child and crouched to Hannah's level, deliberately making herself smaller, less threatening. She formed a simple greeting in the universal sign language of the Plains, a gesture Hannah clearly recognized, for her tense posture relaxed slightly. Michael, meanwhile, had secured both hunters and was interrogating Benson in low, menacing tones. "Where's Davis? And how many more of William's dogs are out there hunting?" Benson, ashen-faced from blood loss and fear, muttered, "Just us three. Davis is probably dead by now. The crow caught him by the horses." "And the rest of your pleasant company from Black Creek, where are they?" "Back at Fort Laramie, waiting for word." Benson's eyes darted toward Sarah and Hannah. "Williams wants the woman and child, says they're witnesses." "Witnesses to his massacre, you mean?" Michael spat. "Just following orders, I suppose, like at Sand Creek or Washita?" James, finally catching his breath, moved to check on Sarah and Hannah. The woman was clearly at the end of her strength, the exertion of the fight having reopened her wound. Blood seeped through her dress, staining the fabric a darker shade. "Let me see," he said gently, guiding her to sit on one of the few chairs that had survived the melee. "Hannah first," Sarah insisted. "Make sure—" "She's fine," James assured her, glancing to where Hannah was cautiously approaching Waking Dove, who had produced a small carved animal from her blanket, a peace offering the child accepted with solemn dignity. "She's braver than most grown men I've known." While James tended to Sarah's wound, Michael and the Crow warriors dealt with the hunters. Silas had regained consciousness, only to find himself bound back-to-back with Benson, both men secured to a support post with rawhide thongs. "The storm's letting up," Michael informed the group after checking outside. "We need to move before more of Williams's men come looking for these two." "Davis had dogs," Benson volunteered, apparently hoping cooperation might improve his chances. "Trained manhunters. If they're loose, they'll circle back here eventually." Michael nodded grimly. "All the more reason to be gone. My place is 2 days' ride in good weather, but we've got horses and a travois for the wounded." He looked at James questioningly. "Unless you had other plans." "Your valley was always our destination," James confirmed, "though I wasn't expecting a rescue party." A hint of a smile appeared beneath Michael's frost-crusted beard. "Wasn't planning on it myself, until a crow hunting party brought word of white men tracking a woman and child through sacred ground. When they described a military doctor traveling with them, I had a feeling it might be you." "How did you know where to find us?" Michael gestured to one of the Crow warriors. "Red Hawk here knew of this trading post, said if you were following the hidden path, this is where you'd emerge." James glanced at Hannah, who was watching the exchange with intense focus. "We had an excellent guide." The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Sarah's wound was properly cleaned and rebandaged, provisions were gathered, and a heated debate ensued about what to do with the hunters. The Crow warriors favored a permanent solution, but Michael, mindful of potential repercussions, argued for a more measured approach. "We leave them here," he finally decided, "bound but with access to water and enough firewood to survive until their friends come looking." "They'll report back to Williams," James warned. "Lead him straight to your valley." Michael's expression hardened. "Let them try. The pass to our valley is guarded by more than men." He exchanged a meaningful look with Waking Dove, who nodded slightly, some unspoken understanding passing between them. As they prepared to depart, Hannah approached the bound hunters, her small face solemn. James moved to intercept her, concerned by her proximity to men who had tried to capture or kill her, but Sarah gently restrained him. "Let her," she murmured. "This is important." Hannah stood before Benson and Silas, studying them with an intensity that seemed to unnerve even these hardened men. Then, with deliberate movements, she removed the medicine pouch from around her neck and placed it on the floor just beyond their reach. "What's she doing?" James whispered, shocked by the surrender of something so precious. "Not surrendering," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with fierce pride, demonstrating power. "The pouch contains protection magic. By showing she doesn't need it against them, she declares them powerless." The symbolism wasn't lost on the hunters. Benson paled, while Silas cursed under his breath, suddenly unable to meet the silent child's gaze. In the world of frontier superstition, such gestures carried weight, and Hannah, young as she was, clearly understood how to wield that power. As she turned away, Hannah caught James's eye and made a single, swift gesture, one he'd come to recognize as her sign for thinking heart. Then she deliberately retrieved her medicine pouch and returned it to its place around her neck. The message was clear. These men were not worth her medicine, but James still was. Outside, the storm had indeed diminished, though snow still fell steadily. Michael's party had brought 5 horses, including a sturdy pony that Hannah regarded with obvious delight, perhaps her first moment of childlike joy since James had known her. "She can ride with me," Waking Dove offered, speaking English with a slight accent. "I'll teach her Shoshone signs as we travel." The offer touched James deeply. Already, these strangers were accepting Hannah for who she was, recognizing her unique abilities rather than seeing only her limitations. It was precisely the environment he'd hoped to find for her and Sarah. They mounted quickly. Sarah settled on the travois that Michael's people had constructed, well padded with furs against the cold. Before departing, Michael approached the trading. He post door one last time, addressing the bound hunters within. "When Williams comes looking, tell him this," he called, his voice carrying through the still open doorway. "The Cheyenne woman and her child are under the protection of Michael Tucker and the Ghost Valley people. Any man who comes hunting them forfeits his life." He paused, then added with deadly seriousness, "And I always collect what's owed." With that final warning delivered, they set off into the fading storm, a strange procession winding westward, through snow-draped mountains. James rode alongside Sarah's travois, continuously monitoring her condition. Though weak from blood loss and exertion, her eyes remained clear and determined, occasionally seeking Hannah riding ahead with Waking. "Dove, you found your friend," Sarah said after they had traveled for some miles in relative silence. "As promised." "We found him," James corrected. "Or rather, he found us." "He is like you," she observed, "a man between worlds." James considered this. Michael made his choice years ago, left the army, married Waking Dove, built something new in the valley. He hesitated before adding, "I've been adrift since the war ended, since losing my family." Sarah studied him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond his words. "Not adrift now," she said simply. "Now you have purpose." The certainty in her voice gave James pause. His impulsive decision to help Sarah and Hannah escape the massacre had evolved into something far more significant than he'd anticipated. He had thrown away his military career, risked his life, and in the process found connections that had begun to heal wounds he'd thought permanent. "I suppose I do," he acknowledged. As twilight approached, they made camp in a sheltered canyon, where wind-sculpted rock formations provided natural windbreaks. The Crow warriors, who had accompanied them this far, would return to their territory at dawn, but for tonight the unlikely group shared fire and food beneath stars that emerged as the clouds finally dispersed. Hannah proved to be the unexpected bridge between disparate worlds. Her facility with different sign languages allowed her to communicate with everyone present, transcending barriers of tribe and culture. James watched in amazement as she engaged in animated conversation with Michael and Waking Dove's 2 sons, boys, perhaps a year older and younger than herself, who had clearly grown up using the universal sign language of the plains. "She fits here," Sarah murmured, following James's gaze to where Hannah was teaching the boys a Cheyenne game involving pebbles arranged in intricate patterns. "Already belongs." The observation carried undercurrents of both joy and sadness, a mother's conflicted emotions at seeing her child find connection so easily in a place not of their own making. "You both could belong here," James said carefully. "Michael's Valley. It's a sanctuary for people who don't fit neatly into either world, like you and Hannah, like me, perhaps." Sarah's expression revealed little, but James had come to recognize the subtle signs of her considering important matters, the slight furrow between her brows, the way her fingers unconsciously traced the beadwork on her dress. What of our people? Those who went north? It was a valid question, one James had been pondering himself. The journey north is dangerous, especially for a woman and child alone. The army patrols the routes, and winter makes mountain crossings nearly impossible. He paused, choosing his next words with care. Perhaps the valley could be a temporary haven, a place to heal, to plan, to wait for safer conditions. Before Sarah could respond, Michael approached their fire, carrying 2 steaming cups of a fragrant tea Waking Dove had prepared. "For strength and healing," he said, handing them the cups before settling on a log across from them. "A Shoshone remedy that saved my hide more times than I can count." Sarah accepted the offering with a respectful nod, inhaling the aromatic steam before taking a cautious sip. Her eyebrows rose in appreciation of the taste, a small but significant acceptance of this other tribe's medicine. Michael watched her reaction with approval, then turned to James. "We should reach the valley by tomorrow evening if the weather holds. You'll find it has changed since your last visit. More families, proper cabins instead of lodges, even a small school Waking Dove runs for the children." "School?" Sarah asked, suddenly alert. "What kind?" Michael understood her concern immediately. "Not like the government schools," he assured her. "No one takes children from their parents here. Waking Dove teaches reading and writing in English, because it's necessary to navigate the changing world, but also Shoshone language, crow signs, traditional knowledge." He glanced toward where Hannah played with his sons. "Your daughter would be welcome there." The tension in Sarah's shoulders eased slightly, but doubt lingered in her eyes. "How long can such a place exist? When soldiers come, they won't find us easily," Michael interrupted. "The valley is protected by natural barriers known only to those we trust." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I won't lie to you, Sarah Blackfeather. The world outside is growing more dangerous for our kind with each passing year. The old ways are being crushed beneath an iron tide of progress that leaves no room for difference." He gestured to the diverse group gathered around their fires, Crow, Shoshone, Cheyenne, White, all sharing space and purpose despite histories of conflict. "But here, we're building something different, not clinging to the past, not surrendering to the future, but creating a third path." Sarah considered his words, her gaze returning to Hannah, who was now teaching the boys what appeared to be Cheyenne signs, her small hands moving with the fluidity of a native speaker. The child looked happier than James had ever seen her, temporarily freed from the constant vigilance that had marked her young life. "How many Cheyenne in your valley?" Sarah asked finally. 3 families, Michael replied. "From the southern bands, like yourself. They came after Sand Creek seeking sanctuary." He hesitated before adding, "One is a medicine woman skilled in traditional healing practices. Hannah might train with her if that's your wish." The possibility clearly resonated with Sarah, whose expression softened as she contemplated her daughter's potential future. She has the gift, like her father. Night deepened around them, stars blazing in the crystal-clear mountain air. The children had fallen asleep near Waking Dove's fire. Hannah curled between the 2 boys, like siblings who had known each other all their lives. James watched as Sarah's attention remained fixed on her daughter, complex emotions playing across her usually guarded features. "You're welcome to continue north when spring comes," James said quietly. "No one would stop you. But until then," he trailed off, leaving the invitation open. Sarah turned to him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "And you, thinking heart, what path do you choose?" The question caught James by surprise. He had been so focused on bringing Sarah and Hannah to safety that he hadn't fully considered his own future beyond that immediate goal. Return to the army was impossible now. He would be court-martialed for desertion at best, charged with treason at worst. Yet the alternative, remaining in Michael's Valley, meant committing to a life on the margins, forever between worlds. "I think," he said slowly, the answer forming as he spoke, "that I'm tired of running from grief, tired of serving a system I no longer believe in." He met Sarah's gaze directly. "I'm a healer. My skills could be useful in the valley, helping both native and white residents who have no access to medical care." Michael, who had been listening quietly, nodded in agreement. "We've needed a doctor for years. Waking Dove does what she can with traditional medicine, but there are some conditions beyond her training." The possibility crystallized in James's mind, a purpose worthy of his skills, a community that valued healing above division, a chance to rebuild something meaningful from the ashes of his former life. "Then it's settled," he said with growing conviction. "If you'll have me, I'll stay." Michael clasped his arm in wordless acceptance of the commitment. Sarah's expression remained thoughtful, but James thought he detected a hint of approval in the slight upward curve of her lips. "Hannah needs protecting," she said after a moment, "teaching, growing as both Cheyenne and something new." Her eyes met James's. "She trusts you. Rare gift from one who has lost so much." "I would never betray that trust," James promised. Sarah nodded once, decisively. "Then we stay, until spring comes. Then we decide again." It wasn't a permanent commitment, but it was a beginning, a chance for healing, for growth, for discovering what might exist between them beyond the intensity of shared survival. James felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness he'd carried since the battlefields of Virginia finally beginning to ease. Later, as the fires burned low and most of the camp slept, James sat alone, keeping watch beneath the vast starry sky. The wooden horse and blue stone rested in his palm, gifts from Hannah that now seemed prophetic. They had led him to this moment of decision, this commitment to a new path. From the darkness, Sarah approached, moving silently despite her injury. She settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I never thanked you," she said softly, "for finding us in the snow, for seeing us as people, not enemies." "You never needed to thank me," James replied. "What I did was the bare minimum of human decency." Sarah shook her head slightly. "No, was bravery. It was a choice." She gazed upward at the stars, her profile outlined in silver by the moonlight. Many men would have chosen differently. They sat in companionable silence for a time, each lost in private thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hannah's father, Matthew, believed in bridges between worlds, said that the future belonged to those who could walk in many realities." She turned to James, her expression earnest in the darkness. "Maybe that is why the Creator sent you to, as to be such a bridge." The responsibility implicit in her words humbled James. He had spent years feeling adrift, purposeless, only to discover that purpose might not be something grand or dramatic, but simply being present and useful to those who needed him most. "I'll try to be worthy of that role," he said sincerely. Sarah's hand found him in the darkness, her fingers warm against his skin. Not a romantic gesture necessarily, but one of human connection. Two souls recognizing their shared journey. "We are all broken in different ways," she said, "but maybe together we make something whole." As the night deepened around them, James felt the first stirrings of genuine hope he'd experienced since the war had taken everything he loved. Tomorrow, they would reach Michael's Valley, beginning a new chapter in all their lives. What shape that chapter would take remained uncertain, But for the first time in years, James Holloway found himself looking forward to the journey ahead. And beside him sat Sarah Blackfeather, a woman who had survived unimaginable loss, yet maintained her dignity and fierce protective love for her extraordinary daughter. In her resilience, James found inspiration. In her cautious trust, a profound gift. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal witnesses to the small human dramas playing out beneath. Their distant light, somewhere in the vast cosmos, James thought. Perhaps Caroline and Thomas watched as well, finally at peace with his decision to embrace life once more. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in this moment of quiet understanding beneath the infinite sky, was enough. 10 years later, 1878, the valley lay bathed in summer sunlight. A hidden Eden nestled among the western mountains. Meadows bloomed with wildflowers. Log cabins dotted the landscape in harmonious clusters, and the clear stream that bisected the settlement sparkled like scattered diamonds. James Holloway stood on the porch of his clinic, surveying the community that had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. At 52, his hair had turned completely silver, and the lines on his face had deepened, but his posture remained straight, his hands steady, the hands of a healer who had found his true purpose. The clinic itself was a testament to the valley's unique character, a blend of Western medicine and indigenous healing traditions. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, alongside meticulously organized shelves of medical supplies. Anatomical charts shared wall space with Cheyenne healing circles and Shoshone medicine wheels. "Dr. Holloway," a voice called from down the path, "they need you at the schoolhouse." James turned to see Thomas Tucker, Michael and Waking Dove's younger son, now a tall young man of 19, jogging toward him. "What's happened?" James asked, immediately reaching for his medical bag. Thomas grinned, dispelling any concern about an emergency. "Nothing bad. Hannah sent me. The baby's coming early." Relief and excitement swept through James. Rachel's baby. Now! But she wasn't due for another 2 weeks. "You know how these things go," Thomas shrugged, still smiling. "Hannah says the little one is impatient to join our world." James secured his bag and fell into step beside Thomas, their long strides eating up the distance to the schoolhouse. "Did Hannah say how Rachel is doing?" "Calm as still water, according to her. Sarah's already there, and my mother." The mention of Sarah brought a smile to James's face. 10 years of partnership, both professional and personal, had deepened. Their connection into something neither could have imagined during those desperate days of escape and survival. The schoolhouse sat on a gentle rise, overlooking the valley, its windows open to catch the summer breeze. Unlike the grim institutional buildings where the government forced indigenous children, this school celebrated diversity. Inside its walls, children of mixed heritage learned in multiple languages, studying both Western knowledge and traditional wisdom. Hannah had transformed the building's loft into a birthing room where valley women could deliver their babies in comfort and dignity, attended by both James's medical expertise and the traditional birthing knowledge of Sarah and Waking Dove. As James approached, 15-year-old Joseph, Hannah's half-brother, sat on the schoolhouse steps whittling a small wooden horse. The boy looked up with a smile that mirrored his mother's. "Sarah says to hurry," he signed rapidly. "Baby's eager." James nodded, ruffling the boy's dark hair as he passed. Joseph had been an unexpected blessing, born 3 years after their arrival in the valley, living proof of the healing and renewal they had found here. Inside the schoolhouse, children's artwork covered the walls, paintings and drawings depicting both traditional indigenous life and the unique mixed culture of the valley. At 24, Hannah had proven to be a gifted teacher, her inability to hear heightening other senses that made her exceptionally attuned to her students' needs. James climbed the ladder to the loft, medical bag in hand, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and focus that accompanied every birth. In the decades since establishing the Valley's medical practice, he had delivered more than 30 babies, children of hope born into a community that existed beyond the reach of prejudice and persecution. The birthing room was warm and bright, windows open to the mountain air. Rachel Two Stars, a young Lakota woman who had fled the increasingly desperate conditions of the reservation system, lay on a birth pallet surrounded by women. Sarah knelt at her side, murmuring encouragement, while Waking Dove prepared herbal remedies at a small table. Hannah stood at the foot of the pallet, her hands moving in soothing patterns as she signed encouragement that Rachel, who had learned Valley Sign Language during her 2 years in the community, clearly understood, despite her labor pains. When Hannah spotted James, her face lit with the smile that still reminded him of the first time he'd seen it. That moment, in the shelter, when the solemn child had finally begun to trust him. Now a striking young woman, with her mother's dignity and determination, Hannah had grown into her role as the Valley's bridge between cultures, between hearing and deaf worlds, between traditional healing and Western medicine. She's progressing. Quickly, Hannah signed, her movements swift and precise. Water broke an hour ago. Contractions are 3 minutes apart. James nodded, washing his hands in the basin Waking Dove had prepared. Let's have a look, he said, making sure Hannah could see his lips. The next hour passed in the timeless rhythm of birth, pain and effort, encouragement and support, the ancient knowledge of women's bodies working in harmony with selective applications of medical science. James had learned to step back when traditional methods were sufficient, to offer his skills when needed, and to recognize that healing often involved more than physical intervention. Sarah caught his eye across Rachel's straining form, a look passing between them that spoke volumes. They had built this practice together, the army surgeon and the Cheyenne healer, learning from each other, creating something neither could have accomplished alone. When Rachel's daughter finally entered the world with a robust cry, the women of the room shared smiles of relief and joy. Hannah took the infant first, checking her carefully, before wrapping her in a soft blanket decorated with symbols from multiple tribal traditions. Strong lungs, Sarah commented, helping Rachel into a more comfortable position. Good spirit. James completed his examination of both mother and child, finding them healthy and whole. As he watched Hannah place the newborn in Rachel's arms, he felt the familiar swell of gratitude for this life he'd never imagined possible. Later, as sunset painted the valley in gold and crimson, James and Sarah walked home together along the stream path. Their cabin stood apart from the main settlement, a deliberate choice that gave them privacy while remaining within easy reach if medical emergencies arose. Another perfect delivery, James remarked, his arm comfortably around Sarah's shoulders. Hannah's becoming as skilled a midwife as you, Sarah smiled with maternal pride. She sees patterns others miss, knows when the baby will come even before the mother does. Joseph was disappointed to miss the excitement, James said. He's determined to become a healer himself someday. Like his father, Sarah replied, the simple acknowledgement warming James as it always did. Their marriage 5 years earlier had formalized a bond that had been growing since those first desperate days of escape. Though their worlds of origin could not have been more different, they had built a shared life that honored both traditions while creating something entirely new, much like the valley itself. The cabin came into view as they rounded a bend in the path, a sturdy structure built by community hands, with a covered porch where patients often waited during James's clinic hours. Nearby stood a smaller building, Hannah's home since she had turned 18 and declared her independence while remaining deeply connected to her family. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney, signaling that Joseph had started dinner preparations as promised. At 12, He was already remarkably self-sufficient, embodying the valley's ethos of communal responsibility. "I received a letter from Michael today," James said as they approached the cabin. "He should return from his supply expedition by weeks." "Weekend," Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Did he hear news of the Cheyenne in the north?" The question carried echoes of old considerations. Though they had chosen to make the valley their permanent home, Sarah had never forgotten her original people, maintaining connections through Michael's occasional journeys to trading posts and settlements. "Some have found refuge in Canada," James confirmed. "Others are struggling, the buffalo nearly gone, government rations insufficient." He hesitated before adding, "He says there's talk of another uprising, though he thinks it unlikely to succeed." Sarah sighed, the sound carrying the weight of history and the knowledge of what her people continued to endure. "They fight because there is no choice. Die fighting or die slowly on reservations." James couldn't argue with her assessment. The decade since their arrival in the valley had seen the systematic destruction of indigenous ways of life accelerate across the West. Ghost Valley, as their settlement had come to be known, remained a rare sanctuary, protected by its isolation, by Michael's strategic land purchases under various names, and by a network of allies who helped divert attention from their existence. "Speaking of news," Sarah said, changing the subject as they reached their porch, "Hannah has made a decision about Thomas's proposal." James raised an eyebrow, trying to conceal his intense interest in this particular development. Thomas Tucker had been courting Hannah for nearly a year, their childhood friendship having blossomed into something deeper. The young man had learned to sign with remarkable fluency, and his patient, steady nature complemented Hannah's more intense personality. "And?" James prompted when Sarah didn't immediately continue. A smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth. "She will tell him yes after the autumn harvest ceremony." Relief and happiness washed through James. He had watched Hannah grow from a traumatized, silent child into a confident, extraordinary woman. Her deafness, once viewed by others as a limitation, had become integral to her unique perspective and gifts. Thomas, with his bicultural upbringing as the son of Michael and Waking Dove, understood better than most the value of existing between worlds. "They'll be good for each other," he said simply. Inside the cabin, they found Joseph setting the table, his movements deliberately careful with the ceramic dishes Hannah had crafted. The boy looked up with a smile that still startled James with its uncanny resemblance to his own father's, a grandfather Joseph had never known, but whose stories he had absorbed through James's memories. "Hannah's coming for dinner," Joseph signed, and spoke simultaneously, a natural bilingualism that characterized many of the valley's children. "She's bringing strawberries from her garden." As if summoned by her name, Hannah appeared in the doorway, a basket of plump red berries in her hands. She set them on the table and embraced her mother, then James, before engaging Joseph in a rapid exchange of signs that left the adults struggling to follow. Watching his children together, Hannah, the survivor who had guided them to safety through her extraordinary perception, and Joseph, born into the peace they had risked everything to find, James felt a familiar wave of wonder at the family they had created. Later, as darkness settled over the valley and Hannah had returned to her own cabin, James sat on the porch with Sarah, sharing the comfortable silence that had become one of the foundations of their relationship. Stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air, while the distant sounds of the settlement, music from someone's fiddle, the occasional laugh or call, drifted to them on the night breeze. 10 years, Sarah said softly, her English now fluent after a decade of daily use alongside her native Cheyenne. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime since we fled through the snow. Other times, like yesterday," James finished for her, taking her hand in his. The years had added subtle threads of silver to Sarah's dark hair and fine lines around her eyes, But to James, she remained the woman of fierce determination who had swung an axe at a bounty hunter to protect her child. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, a question she posed perhaps once a year, as if checking that his commitment remained firm. "Leaving your world behind?" James considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He had sacrificed his military career, his position in society, even his identity as Dr. James Holloway of the U.S. Army. To the outside world, that man had vanished, presumed dead after deserting his post, a convenient fiction that provided an additional layer of protection for their sanctuary. "I didn't leave my world behind," he said finally. "I found a better one." Sarah's hand tightened around his, acknowledgement of the simple truth that had guided them through a decade of building, something precious and precarious. From the direction of Hannah's cabin came a flicker of light as she lit her evening lamp. Soon, Thomas would arrive for his nightly visit, the two of them conversing in sign language beside the stream until the late hours, planning a future that would further intertwine the diverse strands of the valley's community. "Do you remember what Hannah called you when we first met?" Sarah asked, her voice tender with memory. "Thinking Heart," James replied, the sign name having become as much a part of his identity as the name he'd been born with. "It still feels like the truest thing about me." Sarah nodded. "She saw you clearly even then, the man who thinks deeply but follows his heart when it matters most." A comfortable silence fell between them again, broken only by the chorus of night, insects, and the distant rush of the stream. James reflected on the path that had led them here, from a blood-stained battlefield in Virginia to a massacre in Montana, from desperate flight through winter mountains to this peaceful valley where healing had gradually replaced trauma. "The world outside is changing faster than ever," he observed. Railroads crossing the continent, telegraphs connecting cities, reservations expanding. I wonder how long places like Ghost Valley can remain hidden. It was a concern that surfaced periodically in council meetings, where Michael and the other community leaders debated strategies for maintaining their sanctuary in an increasingly connected world. "Nothing lasts forever," Sarah replied pragmatically. "But what we've built here," she gestured toward the scattered lights of the settlement, "will outlive the physical place. Hannah will carry it forward, Joseph too. And now, a new generation." She was right, James realized. Beyond the valley itself, beyond their individual lives, they had created something that could survive in the hearts and minds of those they had taught and healed. A model of what was possible when people chose connection over division, respect over dominance. Rachel's newborn daughter would grow up in a community where her Lakota heritage was honored, alongside the diverse traditions of her neighbors. She would learn to read and write in English, but also to speak her mother's language. And to sign with Hannah, she would understand medicine as both science and spiritual practice. "We've done good work here," James said, the simplicity of the statement containing all that needed to be expressed. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, her warmth familiar and essential. "We have." As the night deepened around them, James thought of that first day, the massacre he couldn't prevent, the woman and child he'd found bleeding in the snow, the impulsive decision that had altered the course of all their lives. He remembered Hannah's solemn face as she'd offered him the carved wooden horse, a token of trust from a child who had lost everything, yet somehow maintained her capacity for connection. That wooden horse still occupied a place of honor on their mantelpiece, alongside the blue medicine stone and other treasures they had accumulated over a decade of shared life. Tangible reminders of the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace beneath the vast Wyoming sky. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, whatever changes swept through the world beyond their mountain sanctuary, James knew with bone deep Certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, beside the woman who had taught him courage, father to the children who had restored his capacity for joy, healer to a community that valued both his science and his humanity. The wounds of the past would never completely vanish. Sarah would always carry the memory of her people's suffering, Hannah the trauma of witnessing violence at such a tender age, James the guilt of his complicity in an unjust war. But wounds, as any good doctor knew, could heal into scars that strengthened rather than weakened, reminders of survival rather than symbols of defeat. In the distance, a wolf howled, a wild voice calling to its pack across the moonlit valley. Another answered, then another, the chorus echoing among the mountains that protected their hidden world. Sarah smiled, listening to the wolves' song. "They remind us," she said softly. "Of what?" James asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "That we are never truly alone," she replied, "that even in the darkest night there are others calling us home." James wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer as they sat together beneath the infinite stars, guardians of a legacy that had begun with a moment of compassion in the blood-stained snow and would continue long after their own journey ended, a legacy of healing across worlds that no force of history could erase. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.